name Nick Compton, especially the Compton last name, is synonymous with cricket. But if we go straight to the details of the day-to-day life of a cricket player, what training is involved with being a cricket player? What percentage of it is skill and what percentage of it is fitness?
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, it's a good question. Very good question. It took a while to kind of understand more about what cricket training was. I think when I started, it was still quite antiquated, I would say. Um, Cricket training consisted of running around a field a load of times, and most of your training was probably spent on, performing your skill, the fielding aspect of it, catching, diving. And as modern science has improved and training methods, and we've got more S&C trainers and physios than players in some of the changing rooms now, the way that professional outfits are put together. And I look at it as a stage I went through, but it's definitely become more professional. I think the one thing for me that changed my career as such, I had 12 operations as a player, which people say to me, "Goodness me, what sport did you play? You didn't play cricket, did you?" I said, "Yeah, I did, believe it or not." And I had teammates and what have you that played as long as I did and never had one operation. So I guess, when people say, "Oh, you have great genetics," I always remind my parents that, yeah, maybe granddad had some good ones, but he had plenty of injuries too. A well-known knee operation, they took his patella out, and it's actually in the Lord's the Lord's museum at the MCC museum. They've got his part of his knee. So perhaps it was written in the stars back when I was a young kid. But look, it took me a long time to really understand the professionalism of you could say cricket, but being a professional athlete. And for me, the operations in a way and the injuries gave me a far greater insight into the body and the mind and what I needed to do to of course, keep on a field. So to come back to your question, it was quite a generic training program. I went to Australia as a youngster and I did a lot of boxing. Because if you look at cricket as a sport, it's got an explosive element to it, but then it's got a real need for stamina. Standing out on the field for 6 hours, 7 hours a day. People will say, "Oh, cricket's quite a slow game. It can be laborious and boring," and I completely agree with all of that. But trust me, standing in the field for 6, 7 hours is not easy. I mean, the toll on your hips and your back, and focus most importantly. So I think fitness for me was more about how to stay focused for longer periods of time, and then when that explosive movement was needed, did you have it in you as an athlete to perform that? So Pilates for me, I've got to go back to the injuries and the operations. Pilates was absolutely integral for my own fitness, my own body, my own understanding, and that really changed my whole thought process on being an athlete. I worked with the Natal Sharks rehab consultant specialist, who's still there today. The Natal Sharks are a professional rugby team in South Africa, and there's a guy there called Jimmy Wright, who's an absolute guru, who's trained and must have brought through every South African current rugby player through their injury programs, diagnosis, everything. And he diagnosed me when I was young with an injury called Gilmer's groin or sportsman's hernia, which, let me tell you, was one of the worst things I've ever had. And it went misdiagnosed here in the UK for 2 years. And I was right at my wit's end. And I walked in to see him, having never met him, and he told me straight away, "You've got this operation and you need to go and have an op. This injury, you need to go have an operation." So that was the sort of starting point, ironically, of my professional career and understanding how important the professional training was. And as I said, it got more and more professional as time went on. Strength training became quite important. But for me, Pilates has really held everything together.
That's interesting because if you looked at, say, your grandfather's time, you said it's quite antiquated, its training. Is it the introduction of strength training and Pilates that have been the big levers, as it were, in bringing the game forward? Or do you think there's something else?
Well, I counter that because I think probably halfway through my career, when I got into the England fold and environment, yes, the training became more, inverted commas, professional. But what does that actually mean? I think if you break each sport down, and particularly look at cricket, it's a high skill game. It's a game of skill. So for me, the skill comes first. without the skill, you can run around the field all you want, push as many bench presses and squats as you want, and yes, the body might look great in the mirror, and look great in a nice white skin tight shirt. And when you walk on the field, everyone says, look at this nice fit cricket team. But if you can't bat and bowl, I think you've got no chance. So, cricket will always remain a skill game. And that's why there has been different sizes and shapes in the game of cricket over the many years. And that hasn't meant that some of those different shapes and sizes haven't been able to be incredibly successful, which they have. So I would query or counter this professional movement, not because it isn't great that we are advancing and that we are finding new methods to get better, fitter, stronger. But I still think if you look back at fast bowling in particular, where people would look at the need for fitness in that aspect, because it's probably the hardest skill, and running in all day in a hot sun, over after over, pounding in at the crease, that's where you really do your mileage. But some of the great bowlers over periods of time say, when I talk to them about fitness now, they say it's all rubbish. They do lots of mileage and running, and they bowl for hours in a net. And what's changed is a lot of young bowlers now are being sort of wrapped in cotton wool. And in the short term, yes, they might be managing workloads, but fundamentally there's no soft way through it. And, stress fractures of the back, if you speak to any young fast bowler, I don't think there'll be one that hasn't had a back-related injury, whether it be a full-on stress fracture or not. So what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that you may as well get the stress fracture as soon as possible and get it over and done with, because you're bound to get one. And I think it's getting stronger, and it's learning your action and making that more repetitive. And I think once you do that, I think your body then learns how to get strong in the position that you need, rather than maybe the template of what is strength, and doing sort of movements that actually aren't related to bowling. And sure, they've adapted gym movements to build your core, and I think all those things are great, and I think are part of it, and perhaps have been the biggest addition. But you look back at some of the great bowlers of this of our, not say modern time, of yesteryear. I mean, they did the hard yards. They ran in for hours at practice. They got lots of mileage, and they seem to do pretty well. So I think it is a controversial point, should we say?
If I took you back to any one of your campaigns with England and zoomed you in on what your typical week of training would be, what would it look like?
It would be a mixture of prehab and rehab. So I think a lot of players have always got niggles. I think I can't remember a time I walked onto a field without an injury of sorts, or a niggle, or something I was working on. So therefore, there would be probably a prehab stroke rehab element, just making sure that you were topping up the areas of weakness. So, loads of TheraBand work. Pilates obviously comes into that. And I think once you've done a bit of that groundwork and fired up those muscles, I think then it would be perhaps more into trying to get your gym sessions in, whether that be with the trainer on your own, whether that be in a group session. And that would be obviously hitting your strength points, trying to stay strong, particularly in the glutes areas and legs. I think very important. I think upper body in cricket, yeah, I mean, of course, it's a lot of power has come into the game now. It's a power game, but I still believe that it's a game about timing, and that for me, yes, it helps to be strong, but how strong do you need to be? Some of the smaller guys in the game hit the ball an absolute mile. Is that strength, or is that timing and talent, and the ability to hit the ball at the right time and get your sequencing right? You look at baseball hitting and stuff. A lot of it's about hip rotation and creating torque in your lower body. So there's a lot of that comes into, which I don't think is totally isolated strength. And also, I think when it comes to bowling and batting and throwing, for that matter, obviously, I think your shoulder strength is important. So rotator cuff movements, getting your posture in a good place. But I also feel it's about feel. It's about touch. Cricket's, again, coming back to that word skill. And I think sometimes when you're doing heavy weights and isolated movements, you become a bit rigid and a bit one-dimensional, and you lose that soft touch and that ability to hold the bat loosely and time the ball, maneuver it through gaps, because that is a big part of the game. So, I would say that you try and touch a lot of those points, but then I think your real focus is to try and get yourself into a good place so that the hours can spend performing the skill. And I think for me, it was always about, what do I need to do to put myself out of my comfort zone to overload the skill? Because fundamentally, that's what I need. Those are the incremental changes and differences I need to make.
You mentioned the word antiquated earlier on, and it's interesting because cricket is a very, very old sport. And what I wanted to ask was the reasoning behind some of the fielding position titles. So could you, Nick, describe or explain what the background is behind the fielding position silly mid-off?
Well, you know what? I'd have to go back into the MCC manual and do a bit of cricket history. Of course, growing up, we were taught this, and having been in the game for many years. I mean, look, they are some of the strangest. Now, when you try and explain cricket to, people who don't understand it, Americans, for example, and you tell them some of these positions, they look at you sort of almost backward, and then they realize, and when you tell them that you have to stand in the field for 5 days, and often there's no result at the end of the 5 days, I mean, you've probably lost them halfway through the conversation. So it's a very difficult game, and yes, silly is probably the right name. Where these names came from, I mean, I suppose without trying to use my imagination, silly mid-off. Well, it's a fielder that's very close to the hitter or the batsman, and therefore, if you are standing in that position, you're very silly, because it's not somewhere that anyone would advocate standing while this hard ball is being delivered and that batsman's trying to whack it as hard as he can. I mean, it's almost a death sentence in many ways. So it's like are you silly to be there, almost like it's just a silly, stupid position. The other positions, backwards, square leg. I suppose cricket has an offside and a leg side. And so that's how you differentiate between the two sides of the wicket. The offside is when you're batting, it's where your head is facing towards. That's the offside. And then where your back is, that's the leg side. So positions sort of vary in a 360-degree sort of, looking at a field. The fielders will be in different angles on the field. And I guess those fielders are placed where the ball goes most often over a period of time. And the different types of bowlers that bowl, I suppose over time people have worked out, where to start your position. It doesn't mean you can't change and adapt once the game starts, but I think there's a template which you work from, which is a good point. Why is there that template? And I guess that would be the hundreds of years or the countless matches that have been played over time. And these fields have sort of developed over time. Very strange.
There's leg goal, forward square leg, backward short leg. All very funny.
Very funny. Yeah, mid-off, mid-on, silly mid-off. As you said, fine leg, square leg. Very daft. But I guess when you play the game for so many years, you don't even notice things like that. You have to, it's when you say it like that, you think, yeah, he's actually right. I mean, it's bizarre, isn't it?
Say someone wasn't that familiar with cricket and they've obviously heard of the Ashes and know that there's national teams, but a lot of people will understand football and how football works, that there's clubs and then there's national teams and international competitions, but also club leagues. How does cricket work?
Yeah, very similar. In England, we have counties rather than clubs in that sense. So Manchester United, a football club, a popular football club, the equivalent would be Lancashire Cricket Club or Lancashire County Cricket Club. So Manchester being in the county of Lancashire, so therefore you would play for Lancashire. Here in London, Middlesex would be the county. We play at Lord's Cricket Ground, which is a very famous cricket ground where I spent most of my career, and so on, Hampshire and all the various counties around the country. So there's 18 counties, a lot more than and that would be first class cricket. So that would be the equivalent of playing club football, top tier club football. And so when you play for your county, the idea is to perform well for them consistently and then hope to get picked for your country, for England. So very similar in that sense. Hasn't traditionally had the same money and investment that, of course, football being a far larger sport, although cricket is a global sport and played in many, many countries. Football would obviously have, has a lot more money and a lot more investment in the game, although cricket has changed in the last, should I say, 7 or 8 years, and particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, even more so. There's been the advent of franchises, and India is notoriously probably the country that holds the keys and has the biggest, that's probably the biggest market in the sense that it's got sort of 1.5 billion cricket fans ready and waiting to play cricket. They love the game there. It's almost like a religion in other countries. So they're very fortunate to have such a following, and it's an amazing country to go and visit and see the passion and love they have for the game. But India, through a tournament called the IPL, which is the Indian Premier League, which is almost where this franchise system and so to say shoot off has started, where players are now being invited to play in made up teams, which are being offered a huge amount of money. So where the game is now divided, these players have huge earning capacities, particularly in countries like India with huge revenue and a lot of TV rights and all the rest of it. So they're sort of global superstars there. And as a result of the IPL, other countries and other tournaments have started in different countries now. So you've got this whole franchise system, which has been a bit of a disruptor to, you could argue, an antiquated cricketing system that has been around for many, many years, where every country has its states or provinces or regions that one would play for, and then by doing well, you'd then go on and play for the particular country. Now there are these franchise tournaments that have come in where players are now going, well, you know what, I'll have a bit of that. And it's causing a disruption because now counties can't contract players for 12 months. And even England can't necessarily hold the player for 12 months and be in total control like they were. They've now got to be open to players being able to play in some of these tournaments, because obviously there's big money on hand, and the players otherwise is going to say, look, you know what, I'm actually not going to sign that England contract. I'm not going to sign that county contract because, it's not in my financial best, wishes to do that. So that's where the game has moved forward. And I think we're at a fairly critical point in that, yes, it's great in one sense, is that the game has moved into this faster baseball type format, and has generated a different interest, a different demographic. And the idea is to try and follow football in many ways. And I think, you could say that they've achieved that in many ways. But for us old purists and for people who grew up loving the test match game, which is the 5-day inverted commas boring format, plus the 1-day format, which is also under some threat. There's this T20 format, which is what the franchise. So just to keep it very simple, people listening, there's almost 3 main formats now, which has always been Test cricket, which has been there for the test of time. 1-day format, which has been there sort of since the 1960s, where they've had World Cups, which England won in 2019. And now you've got this T20 format, which is shorter, sharper, baseball-like, 3 hours long. Let's get all the crowds in. Let's get a lot of money in. Let's play players a lot of money, and they can go to different tournaments around the world. And that's where the focus is at the moment. So there's a bit of a threat in how do we keep up with the volume of cricket that is being played around the world, but yet still get the quality and the focus on those other 2 formats, which of course people still love and want to watch.
Every sport compared to football pales in comparison when it comes to the salary of the individual players. But what is the economic landscape of being a professional cricket player? Are you able to do it full time and do it well? Do a lot of people have to take on part-time jobs? What is it?
Yeah, good question. I think when I started, different. It was full time. It was full time in the sense that the contracts were 7 months long. So while it wasn't a 12-month contract, you would play for the season. So that would be sort of March, April till the end of September. So that's when you were sort of due back to training in March. But there was also an understanding that perhaps in those winter months you would go abroad and further your skill and keep in touch. But there was the capacity to go and do some work experience or potentially get a job in the winter. A lot of players did coaching and would keep fit and try and work on their skills, and then other young players might go off to Australia, South Africa to get to play for clubs out there where they might get a deal or an option to build themselves. So that was very much what I came into when I was younger. That then moved on to 12-month contracts where counties and professional teams wanted to have more ownership or control of players and their training regimes. And that largely came through the ECB, where more money and funding came from Sky. So Sky now would then, that money would filter down into the counties. The England would then give money to the counties to then have a bit more of a pot to invest in trainers and what have you, and players development, etc. And that's obviously just grown. And very much when I played, it was 12-month contracts. And to give you a monetary value, I think when you were sort of starting out, my first contract for 7 months was £11,000, which living in London and what have you was nigh impossible, and almost laughable when you think about it now. I think when you were a sort of first team player or regular, I think you're on a base salary of about £30,000, which again was very, very low. And then I think once you become a very established player and are playing good level of cricket, and you're a solid inclusion in the first team, and you're playing every game, and you're a good performer, I think anything from 60, 70 to £120,000 was kind of the benchmark of a decent senior player salary. Those have gone up now because there's been additions to players' contracts in terms of these white ball contracts, these shorter format of the game, so they can top up quite nicely. And then, of course, when you play for England, there's central contracts where England will then decide, okay, he's playing regularly. You now get a central contract, which I think was somewhere in the region of 160, £170,000 and upwards. But then you'll get your match fees on top of that. So, players are making between £500,000 and £1 million if you're playing most formats and playing regularly. And, the top stars, with endorsements might be making £1.5–2 million, and doing pretty well for themselves. But that would only be the top 4 or 5 players. I think a lot of players now in franchise cricket are making a lot more money. There would be a tier there which would be making up towards some good money, maybe approaching £1 million, $1 million. Not everyone, but I think the amount of money in the game has certainly increased.
When you decided after a long and successful career to retire, how was your transition? Because from very young, your life was cricket, training, playing, competing, and then from going to effectively 100 miles an hour to zero. How did you manage that?
Well, how am I managing? That's probably the better question. No, it goes without saying. The transition has been brutal at times. It's been tough. It's been painful. Cricket was more than a game. It was a love, a passion, a desire, a determination, something that a desperation at times, to the need to succeed, often overran perhaps healthy boundaries and healthy limits. The need to perform at all costs, again, breached sort of probably a healthy way or a more balanced way of living life. I spoke to some of the top cricketers in the world, some of the great players, and You always hear psychologists talking about balance, but I don't think balance actually exists if you want to be at that level. There's no such thing as balance. Otherwise, you should go and do something else. So I understand that from an early age, and I think when you're so entrenched and um, so in needing of performance to keep you going every day, that can overspill into a place where life isn't balanced and can be quite unhealthy. And I realized that probably coming towards the end, trying to let go of that purpose, that drive, that adrenaline rush, the excitement of going to practice for a big game coming up and really focusing, getting everything right, being meticulous with your training. The detail um, was something that I live for. And of course, going into matches and feeling like the whole world had stopped and this was the most important thing going on right now, of course, is very wrong. There's a big wide world out there and a lot more important things going on in life and etc. But I think when you're living and breathing a sport, you've got to be totally zoned in and focused. So that it has been very tough to let go of that, to make peace of the highs and lows. You know, I, I suppose you can walk down the street and people will look at me in a way that, hey, you played for England, had a good career, and did some amazing things that, of course, other people only dream of. I guess the difference is when you're playing at that level, you're comparing yourself to the top guys, and that's a difficult place to be as well. Because when I look back, yes, I'm proud, but I also felt I could have done more, and there were little areas where I perhaps let myself down, and it only takes tiny margins to just be off, and perhaps that could be the end of your career or the end of the England chance because they don't come very often. So, yeah, I think gaining perspective on that while seeing how the rest of the world traveling, doing other things, being entrenched in other walks of life, it does make you realize how the rest of the world lives, and it's not easy. It's tough, and it has been difficult trying to find something that I can be as passionate about, and perhaps I won't. It's maybe reframing that, and it might not come through one thing. It might come through different things, and I think you have to look at life slightly differently. But it has been hard to accept that and make peace with that, and also not let go of that identity of who I am.
There's the hesitation there to pat yourself on the back of a great career. Do you have any regrets from your time as a professional cricket player?
Yeah, I do. I do. I think growing up, the dream of playing professional sport is a fantasy for every kid. Even the ones that go on to be the greatest, Tiger Woods, etc., would have dreamed and spent hours in the shower or in the bath and lying in bed at night dreaming of one day holding trophies and being the greatest ever. And I think, it's those fantasies and those dreams that make life worth living, particularly at that young age, is what perhaps separated me from being, inverted commas, normal at that age. I realized sacrifices needed to be made. I realized that I needed to walk a slightly different path, and that was very difficult, very isolating. Made me question what I was doing many times, but it was the dream and fantasy that I held on to through thick and thin. And I think when you finally sort of make it, even then you haven't made it. And when you play for England, there was a very surreal moment when I saw that little kid thinking, "Oh my God, is this actually me?" And I felt quite overwhelmed by the fact that I kind of got here. Now, obviously, once you get there, you don't want to be someone who just plays one game. You want to play two games, and then you want to play three games, and it just never stops. The pressure never stops. The need and desire to want more and to keep pushing never stops. And I think, yeah, I think if I'm being very, very honest and brutal, without trying to be particularly hard on myself for the sake of it, I think there was definitely more in the tank because I was right there and I had it, and it wasn't. Perhaps I don't think it was a lack of skill. I mean, people might have different views listening in, and everyone's probably going to try and talk about themselves in a slightly biased way, but I am pretty brutally honest with myself, because I felt I'd done it. I'd showed myself that I could weather certain storms and perform at that level. And I just think there were some things I got wrong mentally, which perhaps fell outside of the performance side of things, but realized how much it had an impact on performance. And that was managing myself once the pressure ramped up. So, I always talk about, the Federer and Nadals and Djokovic's of this world. When you watch them play a tournament, they have this team and their box there day in, day out, every single day. There is a meticulous preparation, but most importantly, a support system that can be relied and trusted upon. And I think I probably underestimate getting into the England fold, into the international fold, and how much of a ramp up it was in terms of demands and needs. But also, being a person who's quite creative and has an open mind, I was very keen to make the most of that opportunity. But the more I try to make most of opportunity, the more overwhelmed I got, the more things just weighed me down, opportunities, sponsorships. And I wanted to do them all. I wanted to make the most of the opportunity, but I was very understanding of the fact that, take your eye off the ball, and it only takes 1 or 2% at that level. And, when people are operating at full steam ahead, 1 or 2% can be, the end, and can be the miss. And so I probably regret not having more of a defined team around me, and I'm angry with myself for losing bits of focus at very integral times or important times. And that would be my regret. Anything else, not really, because I gave it every single bit of focus and desperation and concentration that I have.
That mental struggle and the creative sides of your personality, which you alluded to, very much come into focus in your new book. When writing it, was it a therapeutic process, or was it quite painful going back over your career with a fine comb?
Yeah, I thought it would be more therapeutic than it was, and I think one of the reasons why it wasn't as therapeutic as some people talk about being is because I am somebody who's quite open and quite honest with the journey, the pain, and the struggle, both with myself and perhaps quite an open book with other people, and quite honest about how it was and how it is. I don't think it was something I necessarily bottled up inside me and struggled to talk about. So yes, while it was nice sort of being more cohesive and more structured about it, it was a story I think I was very familiar with, and perhaps what I've realized now is that there's also a reason to change that story. I think I've become a master of my own narrative, and I think to move forward, I think it requires also changing that narrative. I think major part of the book that was hard to write was the family situation I have at home. I had a sister who had an accident 18, 19 years ago, and is unfortunately ended up paralyzed in a wheelchair, and has had a big, battle with drug addiction. And I think to watch the demise of her life, and the struggle she's gone through, as well as how much it's caused pain upon the family year upon year upon year, and to watch that decline has been very painful. And I don't think I've always handled it as well as I could. I think there's been a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, and that's probably infiltrated into my cricket career at times, where I felt quite resentful of what was going on back at home while I was at the peak of my powers, so to speak. And coming to terms with that and accepting it has been difficult. I think there's been in the last 6 years, I've felt a real need for escapism at times, and both running away from family and maybe the cricket and the surrounds. And being in England reminds me of my cricket career. Being here, people will remind you, doing podcasts, doing media outlets. I try to do all of that when I finished it, because media is an area that I've worked in professionally, but I found it really difficult for me. I needed a time away from it, because it did become too much. And I think that's probably been the hardest aspect of the last 4 or 5 years. I've not necessarily committed to relationships in the way I would have liked, and partly because I think inside I sort of feel like there's still some healing that needs to happen, and I need to find, that in my own capacity before, I feel I can maybe bring other people in a genuine way.
When dealing or having experienced the trauma in which you have done, many people will seek an outlet, and a lot of the outlets will be creative. And you are a very talented photographer. How has your photography journey helped through all this process?
Yeah, look, my mum is an artist. My dad did a lot of photography growing up, and I, as you can tell from my slightly South African accent, um, I grew up in a rich, diverse culture. South Africa is one of the most beautiful places in the world with so much on offer. So I was very fortunate as a young boy to go into the jungle, the bush, you know, be around the wild and see some of the most beautiful parts of the country. And, that really opened my appetite to get into some of these regions, not only in South Africa and other parts of the world. And I think cricket was very much a, a conduit to being able to do that, to go to, fantastic, beautiful countries like India, Pakistan, more recently, parts of Africa, even been to Canada, I've Alaska. I've done some amazing trips, mostly in the name of cricket, and then use the opportunity to use the camera to get out of the changing room as such and get away from the hotel and get away from the immediate pressures. So cricket was a way photography was a way to use my creative outlet, to use my eye to guide me, to connect with people from different walks of life. If you look at my photography, it's often, exploring the raw, untainted parts of the world, meeting people with, or often have had a very different upbringing and experience of life than I have. And I probably feel very grounded when I'm in these parts of the world. I feel a sense of my upbringing, what my father represents as a who had a real affinity for the underdog, and I think there's that side of me of him in me. So I think photography has been that sort of outlet, that chance to really connect with my creative spirits, and it's allowed me to travel. And I think traveling is a wonderful thing to do. I think it if you've got a sort of exploratory, adventurous sort of nature, then I think the camera has been a great companion to really bring it. And I get such a buzz and adrenaline rush when I see a shot or a color or light or a landscape or a person's face or the textures and of a particular photo, and nothing will stop me to get that shot. Once I'm in the zone, I feel like I'm an athlete and a cricketer again, in the real fight of it, in the dog fight, and I'm really in that zone. And I think that's about the only thing that really gets my juices flowing in the way that sport did.
There is, although you could disagree, quite a lot of parallels between photography and cricket. A lot of work that needs to go into the actual point of taking the photo or the bowling or the fielding, etc. There's a lot of patience that's needed, and then you're going to need to spring into action having been patient for hours or even days. Is that a correlation in which you see?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of correlations in photography. I mean, photography is about getting that perfect shot. And in cricket, we play a series of shots in an innings to be out there for a length of time and to score runs that would make you be a successful batsman for the day. So, and there are a series of shots that have taken meticulous preparation, repetition, hours of practice, and refining your technique so that it becomes automatic when you get out into competition. And I think every cricketer, every sportsman is always looking for that perfect shot, that perfect race, that defining shot that gives you that golf shot that makes your endorphins just go through the roof when you feel the moment of talent and execution come together. It's like a euphoria like no other. And I think photography, you're always looking for that shot, that photograph that's better than the next, that shot that's going to, you know, be a real winner. And when you get back and look at it in your computer, you think, yes, I got it. I got the look. It's in focus. And I think there's always a need for self-improvement. And I think there's an athletic capacity to photography. You know, you've got to use your body to get the shot. You've got to use the attributes that you've got to get into position to do that. And I think it's the combination of that work and the result that makes you feel, you know, very, very good. So I think there's a lot of similarities. You know, photography is a series of moments, individual photographs, and cricket is is a series of deliveries that you face, and you can't face the second delivery if you haven't faced the first with as much quality as you have, because if you haven't, then you might be out. So the analogy I always had in cricket was, and I think in life it's very applicable, you know, that first delivery that you face, played as with much quality, concentration, and as you can, because if you do that and you've put the hard work in, then there's a very good chance that you'll be able to get ready for the second delivery, and so on. And I think it's a nice analogy for life that, you know, if you, whatever you do, do it to the best of your ability. And if you start your morning really well, then you've got a chance of going on to the lunch or afternoon and evening, you know, building on top of that. And I think it's the same with an innings, and the same with a photograph. You know, if you, each photograph, you know, there's a focus and an intent in it. And I think if you want to be a good photographer, you certainly need to have the same concentration and focus.
And what can we expect from Nick Compton coming up? You have an exhibition, is that right?
Yeah, I've been really lucky. The British High Commission in South Africa have given me my own exhibition to put together on January the 22nd in Cape Town for some high-powered dignitaries who are going to be there, about 50 people, and then there's a couple of events post that, which hopefully I'll be involved in as well. So that's a very nice creative thing for me to do, and a good chance to sort of show my narrative and story from South African school kid to England cricketer and to part-time, you know, sort of professional photographer. And also, you know, to some of the countries I've traveled and some of the interesting things that I've done. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I think it's, you know, continuing with my media passions. I still enjoy traveling the world and working on various media projects. And I've got a radio show, cricket show that I've started in Dubai on a Wednesday evening, which is every Wednesday evening, which is live and has a good viewership on the Dubai Eye. So that's been good fun, and we're trying to get that bigger and bigger with some, you know, international guests. And yeah, I do quite a lot of business development and in various areas, which I really enjoy. You know, I think being in London and South Africa gives you a good variety in terms of different lifestyles. But you know what, it's always something that I'm trying to work on. I do a lot of leadership speaking, particularly talking about mindfulness and creativity and photography, and I suppose elite performance, that journey and how it can be applicable to sport, to people's lives nowadays, particularly in high powered jobs, executives, etc. The topic of elite performance, resilience, mental health are topics I like to go into quite a lot of detail. And I think the real challenge there is to try and be as relatable as possible. And I think, you know, I think a degree of vulnerability supports that, because I think everyone's, you know, got their struggles. And when you think you've had something really hard and difficult, trust me, there's people out there who've had just the same experience. So I think that's been quite liberating in terms of being able to share that with people in the working world. And I think it normalized what I did do in sport and makes me probably feel a lot better about the journey that I had, and particularly when I can help other people and mentor young sportsmen who also want to go on. I think it definitely makes me feel good being able to help others and support their journey.
Amazing. Amazing. What a message. Nick, thank you so much for coming on. You've been insightful, entertaining, and very open, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Joe. I really enjoyed that.